America, one of the best nations on earth for centuries at this point, and how it has overcome so many hardships, but it's also been very lucky in this time that we've had this country for almost 250 years. Now, what if things didn't go our way and the Americans had to realize what other countries had to deal with for most of their history? Well, welcome to the world of Kaiserreich. In Kaiserreich, and also named Kaiserredux, the Germans win because Kaiserreich is literally translated into King's Realm, and World War One had a Imperial Germany. So how would they win? Well, the USA would keep out of World War One, and same things would usually go our way in this timeline. However, Woodrow Wilson wins in 1912, doesn't really get America that involved in like shipments to the Entente and really not trying to antagonize the Germans, so Woodrow Wilson could get German American support for his upcoming re-election. He would win 1916, stay out of the war because in this timeline Germans would not be so antagonizing towards American Navy vessels, and also not to try to ally with the Mexicans to go against Americans. So Woodrow Wilson would run for a third term, and he would barely win since he had a stroke and he wasn't popular, but he wasn't too unpopular. In 1923, Woodrow Wilson would die like he did in our timeline. He would be succeeded by his president, Alexander Mitchell Palmer. He was a very conservative man who many people would not like. However, due to the Democrats' just modest popularity and more trade with the Germans in Europe, who dominated Europe at this time, the Democrats were just widely popular, and John Alexander Mitchell Palmer would win in 1924. However, it wouldn't be the Roaring Twenties. It'd just be a modest, kind of unpopular way, since in our timeline, when in the Roaring Twenties, we had moderate Republicans who were able to balance how the economy worked. But in this timeline, we would have conservative Democrats putting more emphasis on austerity measures, definitely having our budget be better. However, our GDP growth and GDP per capita would be in the trash. This would lead to Republicans nominating Herbert Hoover, who would still run in this timeline. He would defeat Alexander Mitchell Palmer and become the president, like in our timeline. The Great Depression would still happen. It would still be unpopular. However, due to the Germans winning and there being like less measures against the Allies, the Entente, I mean, there would be more trade and there won't be as much tariffs put on it, making the Great Depression more like the 2008 recession. It was terrible, yes, but it wasn't like apocalyptic, you know? So, yeah. Herbert Hoover, obviously, would still be unpopular, and he would barely get the Republican nomination in 1932. It is unclear, based on sources on Kaiserreich, if FDR would still run against Herbert Hoover, but we could probably assume that. In this timeline, splinters within the Democrats and Republicans would begin to form. First of all, the formation of the Socialist and also the Socialist Party, who was just basically unions within America. And there was also many progressives who splintered from the Republican Party because they didn't support more progressive agendas. Huey Long would be very upset that he wouldn't get the Democratic nomination in 1932 and would later found the American First Party. In this sense, Republicans were very unpopular. However, Democrats would also be very unpopular due to the historic remembrance of Alexander Mitchell Palmer, the former president. In this timeline, FDR would still not gain an electoral majority because the socialists would gain electoral votes, basically dividing the Democrats from getting an actual majority. So, like it was in a few presidential elections, it went to the House of Representatives. So, and due to the Republicans having a slight majority and a few compromises to be made, Herbert Hoover would win re-election even though he wouldn't get the popular vote or the electoral vote. So, we have another term for Herbert Hoover. Now, from these 4 years from 1932 to 1936, it would be even worse since he would not have many legislative good ideas to put in this, since he would still put more tariffs, and in this free trade kind of world we've put in, that wouldn't really work. And without the legislation, because now there's new parties, the old Democratic Party, which is a Southerner-based Democratic Party trying to kind of go to the Jacksonian-era Democrats, which after the Civil War would not be popular anywhere but the South, would still gain a lot of Senate seats and a lot of representative seats. The American First Party would still form, and the progressives, mad about socialists being too left and Republicans being too moderate, would split and form their own party centering around George Norris and Quentin Roosevelt, the son of Theodore Roosevelt. In this timeline, in 1936, would be the epitome of how bad this timeline could get. First of all, the Gardner-Wagner bill would be passed with establishment support, raising tariffs on the Entente and the Entente powers who fled to Canada and Africa after World War I ended, and they would still have a lot of possessions. So the Republicans, who still haven't gotten their war debts back from when they lent money to the Entente, would ask Canada, hey, we want this money back, and if you don't give this to us, we're going to tariff all of your allies and EU. And they didn't, because they didn't have the necessary funds, so the Republicans, Democrats, and Progressives, who would be seen as the establishment, would raise tariffs, gaining a little bit of money to give to the federal government. However, it would still hurt the economy in other aspects. And then the Black Monday hits. In this timeline, the economic world is actually centered in Berlin because most of Europe is allied to or a direct puppet of the Prussian German Empire government. And due to this, along with having the Great Depression still have effect, we'd also have the Black Monday effects, which would even put more strain on the federal government. Now, this doesn't mean that Americans are in the trash yet. There are still some reforms that you could put in this game, which is called Hearts of Iron 4, if I didn't already explain it to you. And now we get to more contentious areas. So, the election for the nomination is even more tense, since the American First Party nominates Huey Long. The Socialist Party nominates Bill Haywood, and the Old Democratic Party would nominate William Murray. And that would be all rosy and very straightforward. However, when we get the establishment, it's even worse. I mean, with progressives, it's easy enough. They would nominate George Norris, one of the founders of this progressive party, with Quentin Roosevelt as his VP. And the Democrats, who had lost with FDR back in 1932, would go a little bit more conservative with the Senate Majority Leader. Alexander Mitchell Palmer would die, and nobody would really care since he was still very unpopular. However, the Republicans would have it way worse, since there are more liberal-leaning parts and more conservative parts. And Herbert Hoover is still trying to gain at least some influence by nominating a more conservative Republican, so it's even worse. In this game, you have three options. You can nominate Charles Curtis, the historic vice president of Herbert Hoover. You could go more moderate leaning with Alf Landon leading the Republican Party, or through some machinery, very corruption based, maneuvering around Curtis and Landon, you could renominate Herbert Hoover. However, he would barely have a chance unless you put in all the effort in this game just to get him reelected. So, it depends on you whether you want Charles Curtis or Alf Landon, so that's kind of yours. But now we get to the actual election. There's way more tensions as there's riots all across the country, also in New York City, and that would be a big issue. There's also talks in New England to join the Entente government in Canada in case of a civil war. The military kind of hating all this because obviously you want to have this happening in your country, would have Douglas MacArthur try to salvage the situation. If he gets support or not from you is for you to decide in this game, in this scenario. Leading up to the election, usually how it goes is there's Bill Haywood, William Murray, Huey Long, Speaker Gardner, George Norris, and usually Charles Curtis. However, it could also be Alf Landon, and it could also be Herbert Hoover. Whoever you choose, and especially if it's not an establishment, it could end up to be a civil war. And now, we're going to get to the fun part of the video, where I explain all sides of this political spectrum and what would kind of happen if you actually chose them. As the official American government, although we are a military dictatorship, it is me, General MacArthur. By the way, I'm just impersonating this. Whatever. But yes, we need to restore order to these United States in times like this. We have sent generals back out in the west, near the Rockies, so they do not get totally invaded without men to defend them. So, we must have a good strategy on this. But yes, so the American government would, in case of a civil war, be overthrown by MacArthur and the military. They would send generals out to the west near the Rockies, where the Pacific states like Washington, Oregon, California would rebel. However, Montana, Idaho, Colorado, New Mexico, they wouldn't have revolted yet, so they would be placed under a military command control so they could defend against the American First Party, who would rebel also, and the Pacific states. The American strategy would also just be up to you if you wanted to play them in this game. However, generally, they would usually go against the socialists first after a treaty with the old Democrats to, stop attacks for a while, and then once that ceasefire ended, they'd go on the attack in the South, try to recuperate their losses, try to capitulate the socialists, then the old Democrats, then the American First Party, and then the Pacific states. That's how you would usually go. However, there's many different parties and countries that would also intervene. So, yeah, let's get into that. It is my pleasure that we have joined the Entente and not go into this war, unless we rebel and still go in this war, since New England would be a new state that would ask the uh, Canadian government, which would be under Entente control, to join their alliance. And usually they would say the Canadians would reply, yes. And the New Englanders, basically centered around Boston, would remain neutral unless you deliberately go on the attack against the federal government and everybody else. But just to make it simple, they're just kind of just being neutral, kind of on their own, so they don't want to intervene, so they're just sticking to Canada. If anyone were to win the Civil War in the game, they would ask the Canadian government whether New England should go back to the U.S. or whether Canada wants to take it. Usually the Canadians give it, since, I mean, the Canadians can't really put a fight against the Americans, especially a united one, but it really just depends. Is me, Socialist Party of America. Scrap the whole voice. Stop the stereotypes of communist, like guerrilla, mass assaulting, like army. Stop. The American Socialist Party is not that. It isn't it at all. In this timeline, it's basically just trade unions along the Rust Belt, which would be known as the Red Belt because they're Reds, and governors would take up positions. And this would be really iffy since it really just centers around the Great Lakes, and the actual more suburban parts of the states would actually not go to the socialists. It's more just the urban cities that would join the socialists. However, since there's a lot of people who would join this, and depending on whether the socialists have enough power, would take New York City, it really just depends. But the main war strategy of the socialists in this game is to quickly defeat the federal government by a massive assault on Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland, and then go against the southern states, as they would still have, as the socialists would have a ceasefire with the American First Party, and then after they're done with those, they would go on the attack against the American First, defeat the federal government military command in the Rocky Mountains, and then defeat the Pacific states. Usually this doesn't really happen, however, it could happen, and it is really interesting whether what would happen if a socialist government would win the Second American Civil War. Now this is going to be even more controversial. So, in the southern states, the old Democratic Party would reign supreme, basically getting almost all of the Confederate states except for a few like Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, more the border states, but the more deep South states would join the I'm basically just going to call them Confederates because they basically were. Now, there's more moderate paternal autocrats centering around William Murray, and then there's the more. I don't think I could say this. I don't want to really talk about this on YouTube, but just for simplification, the Invisible Empire, the American terrorists, if you could catch my drift. The organization that terrorizes many communities in the United States just for not being different and have a 3-letter name that is all like the letters are the same. You probably know what I'm talking about, but just in case, they're the evil, racist people who come from the South who discriminate against minorities. There? Yeah. So in this timeline, you could choose whether to go with the more moderate Murray or the more people. So, yeah, but the main strategy for them is to knock out the federal government, try to hold against the socialists and the American First for long enough until they defeat the Federals, defeat the socialists by going up north, then defeating the American First, the Rocky Mountain federal controlled, and then the Pacific states. There you go. Unfortunately, they do not win a lot. So, thank goodness. There's also a timeline where the African American community would rise up in case of an extremist group taking over so the African American groups could rise up in the South depending on what you choose. American First Party, which would be headed by Huey Long of Louisiana, where every man is a king, but no one wears a crown. And they would be popular, but they would not have the kind of support from the more moderate, less protectionist people, so they want to gain a majority, usually in the 1936 election. However, they have good influence in Texas, Louisiana, Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, that kind of area. So their main strategy is to kind of defeat the Western Command, Rocky Mountains area, then try to hold off against the Pacific states, move into the southern states, and then once they're done with those, defeat the socialists, and then defeat the federal government. They usually also don't win, because the ones who usually win are the Pacific states, the socialists, and the federal government. So, yeah. We move on to the Western Command Center. Now, it really depends, since you need the federal government to actually win the Civil War, and then what needs to happen is that MacArthur needs to be more authoritarian, and then a rising of democratic people trying to overthrow MacArthur would win, and that's basically how you win the Civil War. But mainly, they just support the federal government, so yeah. The Pacific states. Honestly, they have probably the best position out of all of the groups in the Second American Civil War, considering that you only have one opponent at first, and then they could just slowly move east while their enemies just attack each other. So, yeah. So, it really depends, since the Pacific states is not really just an extremist group. It's more the progressives in establishment who are horrified at MacArthur's kind of taking over of DC and all that. So they rise up in the Pacific states, and then they claim to be the actual federal government. And usually they lose Alaska and Hawaii, but it really just depends, and their war strategy is just to move east. So, with that, we've kind of covered a lot of these topics, and what really depends on how this ends is you. So I would encourage, this isn't sponsored or anything, but obviously, since I'm not that popular, but I would encourage you to buy Hearts of Iron 4, even though it's an expensive game, and then play this mod, because it is very interesting if you like history, politics, and all that. And even for me, a little kid, it's very interesting, considering I get to choose just my own path in these kind of alternate history scenarios. So it's very cool for me. It's very interesting, and again, these political opinions do not represent me. I am a moderate Republican. Okay, I do not support basically anything that these political parties and this alternate history represent. Okay, got it. I'll see you all later. Goodbye.